So I beat the final boss of Shadow of the Erdtree last Saturday, and after close to 30 hours, I have some thoughts about the expansion as a whole. I'm not going to go into any details about anything that I'd consider a spoiler, but the footage is of invasions within the DLC, so I can't necessarily make that call for you. Consider this your warning. On the whole, I want to say up front that my feelings on the DLC are a little mixed, but softly positive. I think From Software did an excellent job with some of the bosses, the new weapons and armor are pretty cool across the board, and I really enjoyed the cast of NPCs. I thought the progression via fragments and ashes worked well and was a nice way to pace out increases in difficulty, and the difficulty felt just right to me, for the most part. But as I'm sure you all expected, I have some issues. First and foremost, man, is this just more Elden Ring. No evolution of the formula, no special send-off to commemorate its roots, no careful distillation of everything you've come to love about the game, just more of the exact same game design in more or less the same way. Lots of reused enemies, lots of reused layouts, lots of the same. I don't want to rag on FromSoft too hard for a lot of this stuff. Reusing assets is a perfectly acceptable way to budget costs so long as you can make it interesting, and I think they managed to not make me feel like I was replaying the base game or anything egregious. My issue is that I felt I was playing more of the base game. There wasn't all that much new to look at, not a ton of brand new enemies to break my brain, nothing that made me question the nature of my existence. Just the same old foes put in some reskinned suits. Not to say there aren't any new enemies, but realistically, they're a little few and far between. And when I say far, I do mean far. This expansion is truly expansive, and, like the base game, it uses that space suboptimally. You'll find yourself riding for long stretches in the overworld without any enemies to encounter or items to find. When you do find an item, it's trash. It's all trash. And not because there aren't good items in the DLC, but because only useless items are randomly scattered throughout the overworld. There are always exceptions, but I am firmly convinced From Software only added in all the items across the area as a way to lure you toward different paths and places, because it's all basic crafting and upgrade materials. Which does, of course, pose the question as to why the DLC is so big. The answer is simple. Because it's Elden Ring. It has to be big. It's not allowed to be dense. It must be open by gamer law. End of discussion. But seriously, it's just because that's the design of the base game and they didn't want to alienate fans. For every veteran complaining that they need a horse to get anywhere, there's 100 newcomers who can't imagine not being given as much space as possible between fights. It's shallow and uninteresting design from my perspective, but I'm not at all surprised they stayed the course. And truly, I don't care. It didn't take me so long to get through that I got exhausted or bored. I got a little frustrated trying to explore every corner, but I quickly rallied by just going to some place I knew would have some engagement. But this is a good spot for me to caution you if you haven't already experienced the DLC. Do not expect to find things in the overworld. It is as empty as it looks. Not that there aren't secrets to be found, but the time you're going to trade riding around aimlessly would be better spent focusing on the NPC questlines and dungeons. You can go back and find all the little secret areas and bonuses outside of the dungeons as far as I can tell. And normally, I wouldn't tell you how to play, but I think it's genuinely good advice. I wasted at least 5 hours looking for secrets I didn't find and items I didn't need. If you don't mind taking a leisurely ride around a pretty spacious map, then by all means explore to your heart's content. And on that note, the map is quite vertically stacked, but not in a good way. Just in a way where you can always see another zone, but without any clear way to get to it. It's meant to give you that sense of wanting to go somewhere and not knowing how, to encourage you to search high and low, and it's effective, but not exactly how I like my verticality. There aren't any alternate progression paths between high and low, and while there are 2 ways into most side areas, the paths are still obscure enough to make it annoying to navigate. But that's okay. The world layout in Elden Ring has always been uninteresting to me, and Shadow of the Erdtree wasn't trying to fix it. I don't care too much about it other than to say it's mostly filler. What I do care about, though, is the dungeon design. And I regret to say it's extremely forgettable. Nothing on the level of Stormvale or the Halig Tree, The two main dungeons are the best, and beyond the aesthetics, I found them underwhelming. This was a major disappointment for me. I really wanted to be pushed trying to progress through a dungeon and to actually feel relief when I found a grace, but the dungeons are all pretty much cakewalks, with only a few enemies per room and little in the way of traps. I actually don't think I died a single time to a dungeon mechanic other than maybe falling to a weird jump. And catacombs are back in a few forms, but none of them are any good. There's really only 3 types, and they repeat more than welcome. This isn't the biggest deal, but good dungeon design goes a long way to making me really think about my environment. If I can just move forward unimpeded, I'm not going to remember each step. My biggest obstacle in any part of the DLC was navigation, pure and simple. Finding my way from point to point was a serious challenge that tested not my skill, but my patience. Then again, I have a terrible sense of direction. With that said, no part of the dungeon layout is really anything that's trying to break you. At least, not that I found. And I think it might be a consideration where From Software actively worked to avoid frustration. It seems to me they may want to keep the difficulty focused on enemies rather than traversal, and that's fair enough. Of course, that does assume the enemies are difficult. And they are, depending on your build. I played with the Colossal Greatsword paired with high poise and defense. It's how I play every new FromSoft thing because I have no imagination. It also made the power of the vast majority of enemies a non-factor. Sure, they can hit hard, but I could take hits, and they can't hit me if I'm staggering them with every hit, which I was. I was honestly surprised just how effective it was to rush an enemy and just instantly break their stance. The only time an enemy posed a threat was if I gave them the opportunity to get into one of their many, many combos. I actually got tired of my own tactics at some point and stopped being careful when I entered a room, but it didn't really change anything. I don't want to imply my build was special or invincible or anything either, just wanted to get across that I was able to ignore a huge portion of the enemy tactics by skipping their turn via sword bonk. Though I can't say the same for the bosses. The bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree mostly fall into 2 distinct categories for me. Humanoid enemies with complex and varied movesets complemented by long combos and unceasing explosions, and big monsters who are no fun to fight at all. For the latter, it really comes down to how unreliable the camera and spacing can be. The biggest enemies travel the fastest and are the hardest to hit, which seems counterintuitive, but it's a well-established FromSoft trend at this point. They all punch you in the face while backflipping across the map, and to add insult to injury, they spam high-damage AoEs at whatever range would be least tolerable. I'm being overdramatic, and none of the fights actually bothered me all that much, but I found myself saying, wow, that was really annoying after several major fights. It wasn't a huge deal, but in an expansion where you're only going to get so many bosses, I really want each one to count. Which brings me to the other category, humanoid bosses. I really enjoyed the main humanoid bosses with the exception of one, and the one I didn't enjoy was just because I didn't like the zone I found them in or their dungeon, so by the time I got to the boss, I had been soured on the whole thing. But the rest of them are really good. Each has a clear theme and identity with a potent arsenal of combos and flair. Learning their movesets was a lot of fun and challenging, especially for someone like me who never adapts their playstyle and just tries to power through. I never got discouraged enough to give up, and never got frustrated enough to flip the board. I felt adequately challenged. But I should probably clarify that my categories are hardly definitive. There are quite a few bosses in the DLC, and some big monsters are great, and some humanoids are terrible. So the real divide is what I'd place as real bosses and fake bosses. Real bosses are the remembrance bosses, the ones that come with lore and matter when you kill them. All of those are objectively interesting, though not all equally nor entirely. The fake bosses are the mini-bosses made up of regular enemies with a health bar or some other gimmick. These are at best a novelty and at worst a nuisance. Nothing to write home about in general. Really, the issue is that most of them don't matter and serve to pad out the level. It's not unforgivable, but it's a mistake I think Elden Ring is uniquely prone to making. Open worlds don't lend themselves to proper gating or impactful boss design. Instead, they demand field bosses fill the otherwise empty space to justify having that space. And if you think no boss is filler, please remember that you'll be fighting reskins of base game enemies and duplicates of new ones a lot more than once. But there's no accounting for taste. If you like lots of boss encounters no matter how repetitive, you'll have more than you would otherwise. It's just not for me. What is for me, however, is boss difficulty. I love a hard boss, especially because I am not good at the game. And among the many hard and possibly unfair bosses, there are two bosses that I thought were truly challenging in an impressive way. I don't want to name names, but they're almost certainly the ones you're reading about. One has been well advertised and did not disappoint. They had an aggressive moveset and plenty of tricks. The other is the final boss. I don't want to spoil the final boss for anyone because I really enjoyed my first encounter. All I'll say is that it took me probably 30 tries and I was absolutely using the Mimic tier, who died 2/3 of the way through my victory run. Honestly, I felt the design was clear with these bosses, and really with all the bosses. They want you to use the Spirit Ashes. They added an entire leveling system for them, and there's quite a few to find throughout the side dungeons and quest lines, which, as someone who has always respected but never fully embraced the old school Souls mentality of fight the boss alone in melee and get good, I really appreciated in the design. I didn't use my Spirit Ash for every fight, but realistically, I may as well have. The new bosses can absolutely juggle multiple opponents by way of extremely high mobility and AoE damage. In fact, when trying to summon in to help people with one of the bosses, I found the fight much, much harder in co-op. The added health and unpredictability of the boss actually made the split aggro more of a sidestep rather than an outright advantage. Add to that the presumption that whomever you're helping might not be pulling their weight, and no player having any way to truly read the combos with multiple targets, and you get a fight that becomes as erratic as it is deadly. And I loved it. It's not the first time, but I really appreciate when co-op isn't a way to cheese a boss, but rather an alternative way to fight, and the DLC bosses really nailed it. But I didn't co-op defeat a single boss in my playthrough. Or rather, I didn't use other players. I took every opportunity to summon NPCs to try to get as much insight into their characters and questlines as possible, and generally I found that they increased the difficulty and didn't add much in the way of support. Which is honestly how I like my NPC summons. For those who are co-oping bosses that are too challenging for them on their own, I think it's actually going to make it much harder on them. The Spirit Ashes are excellent support because they are not afraid to tank endless explosions while also managing to deal damage and pull a bit of aggro. Traits not common to summoned friends. Which brings me to a major complaint I have with the DLC as a whole. Co-op is bad. Not that it should come as a surprise following Elden Ring's example, but I only used co-op in a single area, and that was to appease my brother who had taken the time off work, had already beaten the DLC, and wanted to keep playing. The whole area, while much more dense than the base game, is still meant for horseback. Traveling on foot just wasn't acceptable when weighing time against gameplay. Add to that the lackluster and confusingly sectioned dungeons, and you get possibly the worst DLC for co-op in FromSoft history. Truly a saddening experience. Especially because it meant no PvP. I was invaded exactly once while in co-op, and they died quickly without much of a fight. It was a nice gesture, but ultimately just teased me with what I was missing. But I had suspected as much going in. I knew the sort of game Elden Ring was. I just let myself hope a little higher than I should have. Which brings me to my final first impression. Shadow of the Erdtree changes nothing. Elden Ring is still the worst Souls game for multiplayer. There's still painfully little reason to invade or be invaded. There's no content beyond what the PvE offers, the majority of which is filler. I don't think this game can go the distance it needs to. I think the hopes and expectations for Shadow of the Erdtree were what kept the community going over the last 2 years, and now that it's here, just more of the same, I think everyone's mind is going where mine did the second I beat the final boss. What's next? When's the next game? How far away are we from announcement and release? Will it have good PvP? Maybe focus on multiplayer? Or is this the last ember of a dying flame? A shadow of its former self? Overall, I enjoyed Shadow of the Erdtree, but it didn't amaze me. I'd recommend it to anyone who enjoyed Elden Ring, and maybe to someone who didn't but wants to give it another shot. Otherwise, it's pretty much set in stone that Elden Ring isn't the game I wanted. This DLC served only to remind me that no matter how good you make something, it can't fix what isn't there. All the boss design and lore and atmosphere can't do anything to improve unrestricted dungeons and a middling PvP experience with no reason to engage. Invading at meta level is just as rough as ever, and a lot of the new weapons are predictably broken. It'll make for good fun for a while, but in a matter of months I suspect we'll be worse off than before without a horizon to chase. That's all I have to say for now. I want to talk a bit about how I felt about the story and specific design choices once I feel appropriate getting into spoiler territory. Until then, leave a comment if you've played the DLC and all the things you loved or hated. The discourse around difficulty and the review bombing has been really strange to watch, so I'm curious how y'all feel. Otherwise, like this video if you want to see me talk more about Shadow of the Erdtree, and let me know whatever else you want to see videos about. This expansion wasn't really anything I hoped for, so I'd like to make the most of it by giving you, the good people of YouTube, whatever you need. I plan on streaming more because it's just good fun, and I'm gonna start brainstorming other areas of content for when the time is right. Until then, thank you for watching.